Welcome. You have found your way to something special tonight. Get comfortable wherever you are, let the weight of the day settle gently out of your shoulders, and allow your breathing to find its own natural rhythm. What you're about to hear is not a lecture, not a dry account of dates and battles, and certainly not a list of kings and their problems. What you're about to hear is a story, one of the greatest, strangest, most consequential stories in all of human history. It is the story of an island people and their relationship with the sea. Tonight we're going to follow the Royal Navy from its very earliest roots, before it even had a name, when it was nothing more than a collection of fishing boats and cargo vessels that a desperate king had requisitioned in a moment of crisis, all the way through centuries of extraordinary transformation. We will watch it grow from those humble, creaking hulls into the most powerful maritime force the world has ever seen. We will sail, through storms, into cannon smoke, across the grey waters of the North Sea and the brilliant blue of the Mediterranean, and the vast, indifferent expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. We will meet the people who built this navy with their hands and their ingenuity and their blood, the carpenters who worked in royal dockyards by torchlight, the admirals who paced their quarter-decks in the hours before battle, the ordinary sailors who lived and died in the dark between-deck spaces of wooden ships, men whose names history barely troubled to record but whose labour held an empire together. We will visit the mystery of a warship that sank in a harbour in full view of its own king, and whose wooden bones lay undisturbed on the seabed for over 400 years before the modern world pulled them back into the light. We will follow the most celebrated naval officer in history through a series of wounds and victories that seem almost too dramatic to be real. We will stand at the edge of great sea, battles where the fate of nations genuinely hung in the balance, where the direction of European history bent one way or another depending on which fleet held its nerve, long before there was anything that could be called a navy, before there were admirals or ratings or warships designed for the specific purpose of fighting other warships. There was an island. Britain sits at the northwestern edge of Europe in a position that is both a gift and a perpetual source of anxiety. It is close enough to the continent to be reached by anyone with a reasonably seaworthy vessel and a determined spirit, and yet separated from it by a stretch of water, the English Channel, that is narrow enough to cross but treacherous enough to defeat the unprepared. This geography shaped everything that followed. The sea around Britain is not gentle. The North Sea, which guards the island's eastern flank, is shallow and cold, and given to storms that arrive without much warning, rolling in from the northwest in systems that can transform a calm grey morning into a chaos of white water within a matter of hours. The channel is riddled with strong tidal currents that run against the expected direction, and the approaches from the west are exposed to the full force of the Atlantic. For a people who depended on the sea for food, for trade, and ultimately for security, learning to read these waters was not a hobby or an academic pursuit. It was simply survival. The Romans understood this perfectly well. When Julius Caesar made his first exploratory crossing to Britain in 55 BC, he did so with a fleet of about 80 transports, and he nearly lost the entire enterprise to a combination of tidal mismanagement and a sudden Atlantic storm that drove his ships onto an exposed beach and smashed many of them to pieces. Caesar was a brilliant general, but even he had not adequately prepared for the peculiar hostility of British coastal waters. He returned the following year with a far larger force, better informed and better equipped, and this time he succeeded in establishing Roman authority over much of the southern portion of the island. The lesson was clear to everyone watching. To hold Britain, you needed to understand the sea. The Romans built their coastal defences accordingly. Along what is now the English coast between Hampshire in the west and Norfolk in the east, they constructed a chain of powerful stone forts, the so-called Saxon shore forts, that served as bases for a naval patrol force charged with keeping the North Sea free of raiders. These forts, with names like Portus Adurni and Anderida and Rutupiae, stood at the heads of estuaries and on the lips of harbours, their massive walls designed to resist assault, and their quays designed to shelter the patrol vessels that worked the coast between them. It was the first systematic attempt to use a coastline as a strategic asset, to think about the sea not merely as a highway but as a defended frontier. When the Romans eventually withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, they left behind those forts and the roads that connected them, but they also left behind a problem that would define the next 500 years of the island's history. Without a maritime patrol force, Britain was open. The sea, which had protected it under Roman naval vigilance, now became a corridor through which wave after wave of newcomers would arrive, some as traders, most as raiders, and eventually as settlers who would reshape the very nature of the island's population. The Anglo-Saxons came first, crossing from the continental coastlines of what is now northern Germany and Denmark in the 5th and 6th centuries. They were not in the beginning a naval people in any organised sense. They were farmers and fighters who happened to use boats to move across water, but they brought with them a deep familiarity with the sea and a tradition of boat building that would eventually evolve into something remarkable. The clinker-built hull, in which planks of wood are overlapped like the scales of a fish and riveted together, is a northern European innovation of extraordinary elegance and durability. The boats that carried the Anglo-Saxons to Britain were the ancestors, however distant, of every English warship that came after. When archaeologists excavated the Sutton Hoo ship burial in Suffolk in 1939, they found the ghost of exactly this tradition. A vessel nearly 90 feet long, its timber long since decayed but its iron rivets still in place in the pattern of the planks they had once held together, buried under a Suffolk heath as a monument to a king whose name we may never know for certain. But the Anglo-Saxons were not the only ones crossing the North Sea. Beginning in the late 8th century, another seafaring people began to make their presence felt along Britain's eastern and northern coasts. The Vikings, from Scandinavia, primarily from what is now Norway, and Denmark, had developed maritime technology to a level that the rest of Europe could not match. Their longships were genuine masterpieces of engineering, shallow enough in draught to be rowed up rivers well into the interior of a country, strong enough to survive the open ocean, fast enough under sail to outrun almost anything that might try to intercept them. When a longship sailed before a good wind, it could cover 150 miles in a day, a speed that no medieval army moving overland could approach, and a flexibility of movement that made conventional military defence almost impossible. The first recorded Viking raid on Britain struck the monastery at Lindisfarne, a small island off the Northumberland coast, in 793 AD. The monks there had no warning and no defence. The raiders came from the sea, took what they wanted, killed those who resisted, and vanished back into the grey water before any response could be mounted. For the next century and a half, this was the recurring nightmare of coastal and riverside communities across the whole of Britain and Ireland. The Vikings could strike anywhere that could be reached by water, which in the 9th century meant almost everywhere. They sailed up the Thames to threaten London. They sailed up the Severn into the heart of England. They established fortified winter camps from which they could raid the surrounding countryside year-round. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, still fragmented and frequently at war with one another, struggled to mount any coherent response. The person who came closest to solving this problem was a king of Wessex named Alfred, who came to the throne in 871 AD at a moment when the situation was almost desperate. The great heathen army, a Viking force of unusual size and ambition, had been campaigning through England for several years, destroying kingdoms one by one. In the winter of 878, Alfred was reduced to hiding in the marshes of Somerset with a tiny band of followers while the Vikings occupied his capital. He regrouped, he struck back, and at the Battle of Edington that spring he defeated the Viking leader Guthrum so decisively that Guthrum agreed to be baptised and to withdraw from Wessex. It was one of the most improbable military recoveries in English history. But Alfred understood that winning battles on land was not enough. As long as the Vikings could cross the sea freely, they could always return, always bring fresh forces, always land wherever they chose along Britain's enormous coastline. What was needed was a force that could meet them on the water, or at least deny them the easy use of harbours and river mouths. Alfred therefore did something that no Anglo-Saxon king had previously attempted in any systematic way. He ordered the construction of a fleet. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, these ships were neither on the Frisian model nor on the Danish model, but were designed by Alfred himself to be swifter, steadier and higher than the Viking longships. Whether Alfred was genuinely an innovative naval architect or whether this description was simply loyal court propaganda is something historians have debated ever since. What we know is that these ships, crewed by Frisians and Danes already settled in Wessex and by English sailors learning a new kind of warfare, engaged Viking raiding fleets on several occasions with mixed results. Alfred is often called the father of the English navy, and while that title is somewhat generous given the informal and irregular nature of his fleet, it contains a genuine truth. He was the first English ruler to understand, at a strategic level, that sea power and land power were connected, that you could not defend an island kingdom by land alone, that the coastline itself was a military asset that needed to be actively managed. This insight, self-evident as it might seem in retrospect, would take several more centuries to translate into a permanent professional naval institution, but Alfred planted the seed. The later Anglo-Saxon kings continued to invest in naval forces, though the records of their specific activities are fragmentary and often difficult to interpret. Edgar the Peaceful, who ruled from 959 to 975 and whose reign is often idealised as a golden age of Anglo-Saxon government, is recorded as having maintained a fleet of several hundred ships divided between 3 regional squadrons, one in the east, one in the west, and one in the north, that patrolled the coasts of England during the summer sailing season. Whether or not these numbers are accurate, the existence of such a system points toward a level of naval organisation that went well beyond simple emergency requisition. A navy that can be divided into regional squadrons and deployed in a coordinated pattern around an island coastline is a navy with administrative substance, not merely a collection of boats. The return of the Viking threat under Swene Forkbeard and his son Nut in the early 11th century demonstrated both the necessity of sea power and the limits of what a kingdom under political pressure could achieve. Ethelred II spent enormous sums on Danegeld payments to buy off Viking raiders who kept returning for more, and his naval forces proved unable to protect the coastlines effectively. The problem was not lack of ships, but lack of political coherence. A navy is only as effective as the kingdom that sustains it, and a kingdom whose internal politics are dominated by faction and mistrust cannot maintain the sustained attention and institutional investment that sea power requires. It is a lesson that would need to be learned more than once in the centuries that followed. What the Anglo-Saxon period ultimately contributed to the story of British naval power was a set of precedents and practices. The idea of systematic coastal defence, the technology of the clinker hull, the tradition of requisitioning merchant vessels for military service, and the understanding, however imperfectly acted upon, that an island kingdom needs to think seriously about its maritime frontiers. These were not dramatic contributions, and the people who made them are largely forgotten. But they were real, and without them, the story of the Royal Navy could not have begun where it did. History, as the naval historian NEAM Roger observed, is not made only by its heroes. It is made by the slow accumulation of countless small decisions, each one building on the last, each one creating conditions that make the next one possible. The archaeological evidence from this period, scattered and fragmentary as it is, occasionally produces moments of startling vividness. Excavations along the Thames foreshore at Queen Hithe have recovered anchors and rigging components from the 9th and 10th centuries. Finds from coastal sites around the Wash include the remains of fish traps and mooring posts that speak to the density of maritime activity along the Saxon coast. And from Roskilde in Denmark, just across the North Sea, 5 Viking ships were recovered from the harbour in 1962, deliberately scuttled centuries ago to block the channel, and they survive today in a remarkable museum that allows visitors to walk around the actual hulls of the vessels that terrorised the coasts of Britain and Ireland for 2 centuries. To stand beside those ships is to understand, in a way that no written source quite manages, why the Anglo-Saxons found them so difficult to resist. The sea itself, as a physical and psychological presence, is easy to underestimate when reading about it from a distance of centuries. The North Sea in winter is a place of genuine ferocity. The waves build quickly on the shallow bottom, steep and close together rather than the long oceanic swells of deeper water, and the combination of cold, spray, wind, and the constant violent motion makes sustained work on deck both physically exhausting and genuinely dangerous. Men fell from rigging. Men were swept over the side by breaking waves. Men froze to death on watch in temperatures that a modern sailor would consider unacceptable. The clinker-built boats of the Anglo-Saxon and Viking periods offered almost no shelter below. They were open boats, and the men who sailed them were exposed to the full violence of northern European weather for every hour they were at sea. That human beings developed the determination and skill to cross the North Sea regularly in such conditions, to navigate without instruments beyond the stars and a knowledge of the sea's colour and smell and currents, is a fact that demands respect even across the distance of 1,000 years. The centuries between Alfred and the Tudor monarchs are often treated as a naval dark age, a long interlude of improvisation and muddle before the real story begins with Henry VIII and his warships. This is not quite fair. The medieval English state was developing, however haltingly, a set of institutions and practices that would eventually grow into something recognisable as a permanent naval organisation. The process was slow, sometimes reversed, always under-resourced, and driven less by strategic vision than by the immediate demands of specific kings fighting specific wars. But it was happening, layer by layer, like the slow accretion of coral on a reef. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought to England a ruling class that was, at its highest levels, deeply engaged with the sea. William the Conqueror crossed the Channel with a fleet that contemporary sources describe as numbering in the hundreds, though the exact figures are impossible to verify. The Normans themselves were the descendants of Vikings. Their name comes from Northmen, and while 2 centuries of settlement in northern France had transformed them in many ways, their familiarity with maritime logistics remained acute. William's crossing was a masterpiece of planning. He waited months at the Normandy coast for a favourable wind, kept his entire army together in a single enormous convoy, and landed at Pevensey in Sussex with sufficient force to win the decisive engagement at Hastings without having to fight his way through any preliminary resistance. The famous Bayeux tapestry, embroidered within a few decades of the conquest, preserves images of the Norman fleet in extraordinary detail: the distinctive Norse-style longships with their animal prow carvings, the horses being loaded aboard by reluctant grooms, the soldiers watching the coastline of England grow closer with expressions that needlework can only hint at, but manages to convey nonetheless. The tapestry is a naval document as much as it is a political one, a record of the logistics and technology of an 11th century seaborne invasion that no purely written source could match in its visual specificity. Standing before it in the museum at Bayeux, you can read the crossing almost frame by frame, the loading of provisions, the sailors, at their oars, the sails filling with that providential south wind, the hulls grounding on the English shingle. It is the oldest visual record of a naval operation in British history. For the Norman and Angevin kings who followed William, the sea was not primarily a defensive concern but a logistical one. Their empire, and for much of the 12th and early 13th centuries, the kings of England ruled territories in France that dwarfed their English possessions, required constant sea communication. Troops, supplies, treasure, and the kings themselves crossed the Channel repeatedly. John, the most nautically active of the Angevin monarchs, despite his historical reputation as a failure, invested more in ships and naval organisation than almost any of his predecessors. He built up royal galleys, established a system of royal ports, and created the office of Keeper of the King's Ships, which would eventually evolve into the Admiralty. His movements during the crisis years of his reign reveal how central maritime mobility was to medieval English kingship. In a single year, 1213, he crossed the Channel multiple times, inspecting his fleets and reorganising his naval forces with an energy that suggests a man who understood very well that the sea was not his enemy, but his last remaining strategic asset. The institution that kept English coastal defence alive during much of this period was not a royal creation at all. The Cinque Ports, Hastings, New Romney, Hythe, Dover and Sandwich, later joined by Rye and Winchelsea as associate members, were a confederation of towns on the southeastern coast of England that had been providing ships and crews to the Crown in exchange for commercial privileges since at least the reign of Edward the Confessor. Under the terms of their charter, the Cinque Ports were required to provide 57 ships, each fully manned and victualled, for a period of 15 days per year whenever the king required it. In return they received exemption from many taxes, the right to self-governance, and lucrative trading monopolies that made the port towns among the wealthiest in England. The arrangement worked tolerably well in normal times, but it had fundamental weaknesses that became apparent whenever a serious military crisis developed. 15 days was nowhere near long enough for any sustained campaign. The ships were trading vessels pressed temporarily into military service, designed to carry cargo across the channel efficiently rather than to fight other ships. And the Cinque Ports towns, while strategically placed, were spread along a coastline that was still vulnerable to exactly the kind of raiding the arrangement was supposed to prevent. Kings who needed more than the Cinque Ports could provide found themselves either hiring ships from foreign merchants, pressing merchant vessels into service, or investing in their own purpose-built vessels. The medieval period also produced a rich tradition of maritime law and custom that would eventually crystallize into the body of international law governing the sea. The Laws of Oleron, a code of maritime regulations compiled on the island of Oleron off the French Atlantic coast in the 12th century, and adopted and extended by English royal authority in the 13th, governed everything from the wages of sailors to the rights of merchants whose cargo was damaged in transit to the responsibilities of shipmasters in cases of maritime accident. They established the principle that the sea was a governed space, not a lawless void, and that the people who worked it were subject to enforceable rights and obligations. The Admiralty Court that grew from these traditions became one of the most important legal institutions in medieval and early modern England, handling disputes that arose from maritime commerce, maritime crime, and maritime warfare, with a jurisdiction that was often in productive tension with the common law courts on shore. It was the reign of Edward III, beginning in 1327, that produced the medieval English Navy's most celebrated moment. Edward was a king of enormous ambition who revived English claims to territories in France, beginning what later historians would call the 100 Years' War. To pursue those claims, he needed to cross the Channel repeatedly with large armies and to maintain them with a continuous stream of supply ships. And to do any of that safely, he needed to defeat the French at sea. The French, under Philip VI, had assembled a powerful fleet at the mouth of the River Zwin, near the Flemish port of Slees, including French warships and Genoese galleys, hired at enormous expense. The Genoese were the finest professional sailors in Europe at this period, accustomed to the long Mediterranean voyages and the complex naval battles that characterized competition between the Italian city-states. Their presence in Philip's fleet was a serious statement of intent. In the summer of 1340, Edward led his own fleet toward the Flemish coast. What happened on the morning of June 24th was not so much a sea battle in the modern sense as an enormous floating land battle. The French fleet was anchored in the Zwin estuary with their ships chained together in a defensive formation, which in theory should have given them a massive advantage. The English fleet, with the wind and sun at its back, Edward had deliberately waited until the wind changed, sailed straight into them. The archers on the English vessels unleashed their longbows at devastating range, and the French and their Genoese allies, packed tightly together and unable to manoeuvre, took catastrophic losses before the English ships even came to grips with them. The fighting that followed was brutal and brief, fought with swords and poleaxes and boarding pikes across the narrow gaps between hulls. By nightfall, the French fleet had been effectively destroyed. Estimates of French losses range from 15 to 30,000 men, numbers that are almost certainly inflated but which point toward an extraordinarily lopsided victory. The Battle of Sluys established something important. English forces, properly organised and properly led, could win decisive engagements at sea. The combination of archery and close-quarters fighting that had made English armies formidable on land could be adapted to naval warfare with deadly effect. And it reminded the French that any attempt to invade England, or to cut off English armies in France, would have to reckon with the possibility of catastrophic defeat on the water. The lesson would need to be relearned multiple times over the following centuries, but it was first written clearly at Sluys, in letters of fire and iron and salt water. The ports themselves were as important as the ships or the laws. Medieval English maritime power was heavily concentrated in a handful of locations: Portsmouth, Plymouth, Bristol, London, the Cinque Ports towns, whose physical infrastructure of quays, warehouses, chandlers, rope walks and timber yards supported the entire enterprise. The development of Portsmouth as the primary naval base was gradual but ultimately decisive. Its position on a sheltered inlet on the southern coast, with relatively easy access to the channel in either direction, and protection from the worst Atlantic weather, made it ideal for a permanent naval establishment in a way that more exposed ports were not. The streets of Old Portsmouth still carry the traces of this maritime history in their names and their buildings, and the great harbour is still working, still defended, still watching the water in both directions as it has done for 900 years. The 100 Years' War, which consumed so much of England's military energy between 1337 and 1453, was in many respects a naval war as much as a land war, even though most of its famous episodes, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, were fought on land. The logistics of maintaining English armies in France required constant sea communication, and the protection of those supply lines was the Navy's most important function for much of the conflict. When things went wrong at sea, they went wrong on land as well. The loss of Normandy in the 1440s was partly a consequence of the Navy's inability to prevent French forces from landing and operating freely in territory that English garrisons could no longer defend without resupply from across the Channel. The connection between maritime power and territorial control was never clearer and never more painfully demonstrated than in the final phases of the 100 Years' War. The medieval shipwright's craft was passed down through apprenticeship in a tradition that was almost entirely oral and practical, with very little written documentation until well into the 15th century. We know from archaeological evidence, from the wrecks of medieval vessels that have been excavated at sites across northern Europe, that the clinker building technique was applied with considerable sophistication to vessels of varying sizes and purposes, from small riverboats to the large cogs that carried cargo across the North Sea and into the Baltic. The cog was the workhorse of medieval northern European commerce, a broad, high-sided vessel with a flat bottom that allowed it to take the ground in the tidal harbours of the period, a single square sail on a central mast, and a capacity for cargo that the older, narrower Norse-style vessels could not match. When medieval kings requisitioned merchant vessels for military service, it was usually cogs they were requisitioning, and the fighting platforms erected on their bows and sterns, the forecastle and aftercastle that would eventually be built permanently into warship design, were temporary wooden structures bolted to hulls that had been designed for something else entirely. The Tudors came to power in 1485 on the back of a battle, as dynasties so often do. Henry VII, the first of the line, was a man of exceptional caution and financial shrewdness, not qualities that tend to produce naval legends, and yet it was he who made the first genuinely transformative investment in English sea power. In 1495, at Portsmouth, Henry VII ordered the construction of the first dry dock in England, a massive excavation of stone and timber, filled and emptied by a series of sluice gates that allowed a ship to be floated in, supported on wooden blocks as the water drained away, and then worked on in the dry. This sounds like a technical detail, a piece of infrastructure, but it was in fact a revolution. Before the dry dock, ships deteriorated rapidly and almost inevitably. The underwater sections of a wooden hull, perpetually wet and warm, were an ideal habitat for the teredo worm, the ship worm, a creature that could reduce solid oak planking to a honeycomb of tunnels within a single sailing season. Anti-fouling measures existed of a sort, the practice of burning the underwater sections of a hull, or coating them with pitch and tar, or sheathing them in lead, all helped to some degree. But without the ability to bring a ship fully out of the water and inspect its entire hull at leisure, it was impossible to know the true condition of a vessel until it was too late. The dry dock changed all of that. It made large, permanent warships economically viable for the first time, because it meant those expensive ships could be maintained and repaired indefinitely, rather than simply abandoned when the rot became overwhelming. Henry VIII expanded what his father had started with characteristic energy and impatience. He was a young king of enormous physical presence and genuine intellectual curiosity, who was consumed by the desire to be taken seriously as a European monarch and a military commander. By the end of his reign, the English navy had grown, from a handful of vessels to over 50, including some of the largest warships in northern Europe. The dockyards at Portsmouth, Deptford and Woolwich expanded from small workshops into significant industrial complexes, employing hundreds of carpenters, caulkers, riggers, rope makers, and sail makers, the artisans of maritime power whose skilled hands shaped every ship that left the stocks. The most famous of Henry's warships is the Mary Rose, though not for the reasons Henry would have wished. She was built between 1509 and 1511, one of the first ships in the world to carry her guns in rows of gun ports cut directly into the hull below the main deck. When those ports were closed and the ship was under sail, the guns were concealed behind hinged wooden flaps that kept the sea out. When the ship prepared for battle, the flaps swung inward and the guns were run out through the holes, their muzzles projecting over the water. The arrangement was an elegant solution to the fundamental problem of heavy armament. It allowed heavy guns to be carried low while still protecting them from the sea when not in use. The Mary Rose served Henry well for 30 years. But on the afternoon of July 19th, 1545, while leading the English fleet out of Portsmouth harbour to engage a French invasion force that had appeared in the Solent, she sank. Henry VIII himself was watching from the shore. The accounts of those who saw it are contradictory and confused. One moment she was underway and apparently ready for action. The next she had heeled suddenly to one side, water flooding in through the open gun ports, and within minutes she had disappeared beneath the surface. Between 400 and 500 men drowned, their voices audible on shore before they were silenced by the water. The Mary Rose lay on the seabed of the Solent for 437 years. In 1982, in one of the most extraordinary marine archaeology projects ever undertaken, her hull was raised to the surface and brought ashore, where it remains today in Portsmouth. What the archaeologists found inside the wreck was a time capsule of extraordinary intimacy. The personal possessions of the men who drowned with her, their leather shoes and wooden combs, their games and their medicines, their surgical instruments and their longbows, all preserved by the anaerobic mud that had sealed them away from the oxygen that drives decay. There were rat bones in the bilges and the remains of the ship's dog in the hold. There were peppercorns from the captain's cabin, still faintly fragrant after 4 centuries. The Mary Rose taught us more about the daily life of the Tudor sailor than any number of written sources could have done, because written sources recorded what people thought was worth recording, and the objects in the Solent mud recorded everything else. The small, mundane, utterly human details of lives lived at sea in the service of an English king. The Elizabethan period produced not only the great set-piece events like the Armada, but a whole culture of maritime enterprise that transformed how England understood its relationship with the wider world. The sea dogs, Drake, Hawkins, Raleigh, Frobisher, Davis, and a dozen others, were products of a particular moment when the expansion of European horizons through exploration and conquest coincided with the emergence of a Protestant national identity in England, defined partly in opposition to Catholic Spain and its American empire. They were simultaneously entrepreneurs, patriots, pirates, and explorers, and the boundaries between those categories were much less clear in the 16th century than they would later become. Martin Frobisher made 3 voyages to the Canadian Arctic in the 1570s in search of a northwest passage to the Pacific, bringing back several hundred tons of black rock from what is now Baffin Island. In the sincere belief that it contained gold ore, it did not. The samples were eventually identified as hornblende and mica, worthless minerals, but the expeditions themselves were significant contributions to the geographical knowledge of the Arctic. John Davis made 3 Arctic voyages of his own, penetrating further north than any previous European explorer, and mapping the strait between Greenland and Baffin Island that now bears his name. He was a thoughtful and technically accomplished navigator who made genuine contributions to the science of navigation, including a simplified version of the backstar for measuring the altitude of the sun that remained in use for decades after his death. Walter Raleigh is the most complicated of the Elizabethan maritime figures, a man whose enormous ambition and genuine brilliance were persistently frustrated by political circumstances beyond his control. His attempts to establish an English colony in America, the lost colony of Roanoke, planted on the coast of what is now North Carolina in 1587, whose entire population vanished without trace by the time a relief expedition arrived in 1590, represent both the aspiration and the tragedy of Elizabethan colonialism. Raleigh never found the El Dorado he was searching for in South America, never established the American empire he imagined. He was eventually executed by James I on charges of treason that were widely regarded, then and now, as politically motivated. But he represented something real, the conviction that England's future lay on the ocean and in the lands beyond it, and that a nation with sufficient naval power and sufficient will could reach those lands and hold them. John Hawkins and Francis Drake between them developed something crucial. The idea that English sea power did not have to be purely defensive, did not have to wait for enemies to appear in the channel before responding. The sea was everywhere. The Spanish Empire was everywhere, and an English fleet that could project itself across the Atlantic and into the Pacific could threaten Spanish power at its source rather than merely parrying its attacks at home. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe from 1577 to 1580, the second circumnavigation in history after Magellan's, was a demonstration of this principle so bold and so profitable that it silenced most of the objectors. Queen Elizabeth, who had invested in the voyage and shared handsomely in its profits, knighted him on the deck of his ship, the Golden Hind, at Deptford in April 1581. A large crowd came to watch, and the ceremony had about it the quality of a public celebration as much as a formal honour. Drake was already famous, already beloved, a hero of the London streets in a way that few men of his century managed to become in their own lifetimes. The naval reforms of John Hawkins in his capacity as Treasurer of the Navy were as important in their own way as any of Drake's adventures. Hawkins eliminated corrupt contracting practices, introduced the race-built galleon design that gave English warships superior speed and manoeuvrability, and systematically improved the Navy's gunnery. He understood something that not all his contemporaries grasped, that the purpose of a warship was not to carry soldiers who would fight hand-to-hand after grappling alongside the enemy, but to deliver cannon fire accurately and repeatedly at long range, damaging the enemy hull and killing the enemy crew before they ever came close enough to board. This was a revolution in naval doctrine as well as in naval technology, and it would prove decisive in the summer of 1588. The organisation of the Elizabethan Navy under Hawkins' reforms created something genuinely new, a system of continuous naval readiness that did not depend on emergency requisition or the personal initiative of individual commanders. Ships were regularly inspected, their condition recorded, their defects addressed before they became dangerous rather than after. Captains were accountable for the state of their vessels in ways that had no precedent in earlier English naval administration. And the guns, those new, longer, heavier, more accurate weapons that Hawkins had introduced, were drilled and exercised so that the gunners who served them knew their weapons with an intimacy that the Spanish artillerists, trained in a more static land warfare tradition, could not match. The Armada would discover this difference the hard way. The connection between the Elizabethan maritime expansion and the later British Empire is so obvious in retrospect that it is easy to forget how contingent it was at the time. England in the 1570s and 1580s was a second-rank European power, significantly smaller in population and wealth than France or Spain. Without permanent colonies, without a standing army of any size, and with a navy that was formidable by Northern European standards, but modest compared to the naval forces of the Mediterranean powers. The decision to invest in sea power rather than land power. The decision, essentially, to be an Atlantic nation rather than a continental one, was not inevitable. It was made by specific people at a specific moment for specific reasons, and it could easily have gone differently. Had the Armada succeeded, had Elizabeth been overthrown, had England been restored to Catholicism and incorporated into the Habsburg system, the subsequent history of the world would have been radically different. The Navy stood between that future and the one that actually happened. Philip II of Spain had been planning something of this magnitude for a long time. He was, by the standards of his age, a deeply thoughtful and meticulous administrator, a king who governed his enormous empire from a desk in the Escorial Palace outside Madrid, reading reports, annotating documents in the margins with his small, careful handwriting, and making decisions that affected millions of people across 2 continents and several oceans. He was also, in his own mind, doing God's work. England under Elizabeth was a Protestant kingdom that had broken from Rome, that was sheltering Protestant rebels from his Dutch provinces, that was sending pirates to ravage his shipping and his American colonies. Philip had been patient. He had tried diplomacy and assassination and economic pressure. None of it had worked. Now he would send the Armada. The enterprise of England had been in preparation for years. but its immediate trigger was Drake's audacious raid on Cadiz in April of 1587. Drake had sailed into the harbour with a squadron of warships and spent 2 days destroying ships and supplies, and generally wreaking havoc, sinking or capturing around 37 vessels and burning enormous quantities of naval stores. He described this action with characteristic wit as singeing the King of Spain's beard. Philip's beard was singed, but not enough to alter his plans. The Armada simply sailed a year later than originally intended, and the delay arguably gave the English more time to prepare. What Philip assembled in the harbour of Lisbon in the spring of 1588 was the largest fleet Europe had seen in a generation. 130 ships, carrying around 27,000 soldiers and sailors, armed with more than 2,000 guns. The fleet was under the command of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, who had written to Philip warning that he suffered from seasickness and had no experience of naval command, and requesting to be replaced. Philip declined. The letter itself, preserved in the Spanish archives, is a remarkable document, a man essentially writing his own objection into the historical record and being overruled by a king who was operating on faith rather than sound judgment about personnel. The plan was this: the Armada was to sail up the Channel, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army massed on the Flemish coast, load those soldiers onto flat-bottomed barges, escort them across the Channel to a landing on the English coast, and proceed to London, where Elizabeth would be overthrown and England returned to the Catholic faith. It was, on paper, a plan that could have worked. Parma's army was genuinely formidable. If it could be safely landed on English soil, the outcome was far from certain. The difficulty was in the execution. The Channel campaign lasted 9 days, from July 21st to July 30th, and it was unlike any naval battle previously fought. The English refused to close with the Spanish for the kind of hand-to-hand fighting that the Spanish preferred and were equipped for. Instead, they used their superior speed and manoeuvrability to stay at distance, raking the Spanish ships with gunfire and then dancing out of reach before the Spanish could respond. The Armada, sailing in its famous crescent formation, was impressively disciplined throughout. Medina Sidonia kept his fleet together through a week of constant pressure with remarkable skill, but it could not force the kind of engagement it needed to win. The fleet anchored off Calais on July 27th, waiting for the junction with Parma's army that never came. Parma's barges needed a sheltered harbour to embark his soldiers, and the nearest suitable one was blockaded by Dutch flyboats that neither Parma nor Medina Sidonia had the means to remove. The Armada sat at anchor, exposed and increasingly anxious, while messengers went back and forth with increasingly desperate communications. In the small hours of July 28th, 8 English ships were set alight and sent downwind toward the anchored Armada. The Spanish, terrified, cut their anchor cables and scattered in the darkness, and the disciplined crescent formation that had preserved them through a week of Channel fighting was broken. At Gravelines the following day, the English closed in, and the fighting was intense. Several Spanish ships were driven aground. When the wind shifted in the afternoon and forced the English to withdraw, the Armada was battered, scattered, and, facing a southwest wind that made a return to the Channel impossible, Medina Sidonia took his fleet north around Scotland and back to Spain via the Atlantic coast of Ireland, a route of 4,000 miles through waters his pilots had no charts for. The autumn of 1588 was ferocious. At least 26 ships were wrecked on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, and thousands of men drowned or were killed on shore by local populations who wanted their cargo and had no pity for the survivors. Of the 130 ships that had left Lisbon, fewer than half returned. England celebrated with an intensity that bordered on hysteria. But the Armada's defeat did not end the war, and its strategic significance was more complicated than the celebration suggested. What it had truly established was something quieter and more durable, the understanding that England, properly armed and properly led, could hold its own at sea against the greatest empire in the world. That knowledge, once planted, grew into something that would eventually reshape the map of the earth. The aftermath of the Armada's defeat had consequences that unfolded over decades and centuries, many of them invisible to the people who were living through them. The psychological effect on English national consciousness was profound and lasting. the defeat of the world's greatest empire by a Protestant island kingdom seemed, to many contemporaries, like direct evidence of divine favour, and this conviction that England had a special providential relationship with God and with the sea became woven into English national identity in ways that influenced strategy, foreign policy, and self-understanding for generations. It fed the Puritan settlement in New England, the confident aggression of the East India Company, and eventually the Victorian ideology of empire. The Armada was fought in 1588, but in a real sense it was still being fought in the minds of English people well into the 20th century. The Spanish experience of the Armada was equally formative, though less celebrated. Philip II received the news of the fleet's destruction with the kind of controlled fatalism that characterized his personality at its most extreme, reportedly remorenting that he had sent his ships to fight against men and not against the wind and waves. He rebuilt his navy within 2 years and continued to threaten English interests for the remaining decade of his reign, and the total balance sheet of the Anglo-Spanish conflict that followed 1588 was considerably more mixed than the English national myth suggests. But he never again attempted a direct invasion of England, and that strategic restraint, born of a realistic assessment of the costs involved, was itself a kind of tribute to what the Navy had achieved at Gravelines and in the following storms. The Stuarts inherited the Tudor Navy along with the Tudor throne, and they had a complicated relationship with it from the start. James I was a man of peace, or at least a man who preferred peace to the expense and uncertainty of war, and under his reign the Navy was allowed to decline through a combination of financial neglect and administrative corruption. Ships rotted in their moorings, wages went unpaid for months, sometimes years, creating a culture of petty theft and desertion among sailors who had no other means of feeding themselves. The dockyards became networks of patronage and peculation, where officials supplemented their official salaries by selling naval stores and the labour of workmen during working hours. Under Charles I, this decline became dangerously accelerated. His attempt to raise money through ship money, the ancient coastal levy that he extended to inland counties without parliamentary consent, became one of the flashpoints of the constitutional crisis that would eventually end in civil war. When civil war broke out in 1642, the fleet declared for Parliament rather than the King, a decision driven partly by the Protestant sympathies of many naval officers, partly by the fact that Parliament controlled the ports and the money, and partly by the simple reality that ordinary sailors were more likely to be paid under parliamentary administration than under a royal government that had been borrowing against future revenues for a decade. Without control of the sea, Charles could not import troops or supplies, could not cut Parliament's communications with its supporters in the ports and trading cities, and could not threaten the vital link between London and the regions that sustained the parliamentary cause. The parliamentary navy found a commander of extraordinary ability in Robert Blake, a Somerset merchant who had never been to sea in a military capacity before the war, but who proved to have an instinctive grasp of naval strategy that his more conventionally trained contemporaries could not match. Under Blake, the navy pursued the Royalist fleet into the Mediterranean, defeating it in a series of engagements that effectively ended any naval threat from the Royalist side. He then bombarded the Barbary corsairs in their own harbour at Portofarina in 1655, sailing directly into a defended anchorage and destroying a Tunisian fleet in a piece of audacious violence that earned him enormous popular acclaim and demonstrated that English sea power now had genuine reach beyond the familiar waters of the North Sea and the Channel. Blake died at sea in August 1657, within the sight of Plymouth, as his flagship was entering the Sound after a long and gruelling Mediterranean campaign. He had been ill for months, probably suffering from scurvy and the accumulated effects of years of naval service without adequate rest. He was 59 years old, and he had come to naval command late in life from an entirely civilian background, and had in the space of less than a decade made himself the most effective naval commander England had produced since the Elizabethan era. His body was brought ashore and given a state funeral at Westminster Abbey, an extraordinary tribute that placed him alongside kings and archbishops in the nation's most sacred space. The 3 Anglo-Dutch wars, fought between 1652 and 1674, were the crucible in which the Royal Navy was forged into a genuinely professional fighting force. The Dutch were formidable opponents with excellent ships, experienced sailors, and a series of exceptionally talented admirals, of whom Michel de Ruyter was the greatest. De Ruyter was a man of the sea from his earliest youth, born in Flushing in 1607 and spending virtually his entire adult life on the water, rising from cabin boy to rope maker to merchant captain to admiral, with a trajectory that would have seemed implausible in a novel. He was modest in his personal manner and ferocious in battle, and he is remembered in the Netherlands as a national hero on a level comparable to Nelson in England, which is to say, as a figure who embodies something essential and admirable about the national character as the Dutch themselves understand it. The battles of the Dutch wars were fought in the shallow, shoal-ridden waters of the North Sea and the Channel, and they were long, violent, and technically complex. The English and Dutch between them invented the line of battle tactic, the practice of having warships form a single long line, each ship covering the next, that would govern naval warfare for the next 150 years. The 4 days' Battle of June 1666 was the longest naval battle in the Age of Sail, running from Monday to Thursday with only darkness to separate the engagements, ending in a serious English defeat that cost 13 ships and 5,000 men. The scale of the commitment on both sides was extraordinary. Over 200 ships engaged, and the smoke of the battle visible from the English coast for 4 days. The low point came in June 1667, when de Ruyter sailed a Dutch fleet up the River Medway, broke through the chain protecting the anchorage at Chatham, and burned the English fleet at its moorings. The Royal Charles, the English flagship, was captured and towed to Holland. The sound of the guns was heard in London. Samuel Pepys, who would leave behind the most vivid account of this period in his extraordinary private diary, wrote in a state of near panic about what the Dutch might do next. The Medway disaster ended the Second Dutch War on humiliating terms and created the political conditions for the naval reforms that would follow. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 brought with it a renewed interest in naval glory that was partly personal. Charles had been a refugee at sea during his years in exile, had sailed across the Channel more than once under conditions of some danger, and understood the sea in a way that most of his predecessors had not, and partly political. The navy was the most visible expression of English power, and a restored monarchy that wanted to be taken seriously by the European powers needed a navy that could be taken seriously. Charles invested heavily in the fleet and in the dockyards, commissioning new ships of a size and quality that represented a genuine advance over anything built during the Commonwealth period. Samuel Pepys, watching these developments from his position at the Navy Board, was both inspired and appalled. Inspired by the ambition, appalled by the waste and corruption that accompanied it. Samuel Pepys is remembered today primarily as the author of the most intimate and vivid diary in the English language, a record covering the years 1660 to 1669, in which he described with astonishing candour his work, his family, his infidelities, his music, his books, his ambitions, and his fears. He wrote about the Great Plague of 1665 with the detached curiosity of a man who could not quite believe what he was watching. He wrote about the Great Fire of 1666 with the immediate terror of a man watching his city burn within a short walk of his house, burying his papers and his cheese and his wine in his garden as the flames approached. He wrote about the Medway disaster with the controlled horror of a man who understood exactly what it meant and who blamed himself, not entirely fairly, for the failures of preparation that had made it possible. But Pepys was not primarily a diarist. He was a naval administrator of genius, and his contribution to the development of the Royal Navy was as important as that of any admiral. He came from a modest background, and owed his entry into the naval bureaucracy to his cousin Edward Montague, who became the Earl of Sandwich and introduced him to the corridors of power at the restoration of Charles II in 1660. He started as Clerk of the Acts, essentially a senior administrator responsible for correspondence and record-keeping at the Navy Board. He knew nothing about ships when he began, and he set about educating himself with the systematic thoroughness that characterized everything he did, teaching himself the principles of naval architecture, ship handling, gunnery, and provisioning from first principles, spending his evenings studying mathematics so that he could evaluate the calculations submitted by shipbuilders and contractors with an informed eye. What Pepys found in the naval administration was a system riddled with corruption and incompetence so pervasive that it had become simply the normal way of doing business. Contractors routinely delivered inferior goods at inflated prices, knowing that the inspectors were themselves on the contractor's payroll. Ships were registered as fully manned when they were actually short of crew, the wages of phantom sailors going into the pockets of their captains. Naval stores disappeared from government warehouses into private hands at a steady and apparently unstoppable rate. The cumulative effect was that the Navy spent enormous sums of money while maintaining ships in a state of chronic poor repair, crewed by men who were perpetually owed months of back pay, and who responded to this situation by finding every possible means of enriching themselves at the expense of the institution. After the Medway disaster, Pepys was given the political support and administrative authority to address this comprehensively. He introduced a system of regular examination for naval officers, the lieutenant's examination, which required candidates to demonstrate actual knowledge of seamanship and navigation before receiving their commissions. That was the first step toward creating a genuinely professional officer corps. He reformed the contracting system, introducing competitive tendering and independent inspection of delivered goods. He standardized the dimensions of ships' components so that spare parts could be interchanged between vessels. He created naval archives that made it possible to track what the Navy owned, what it spent, and what it received. These reforms were not dramatic or glamorous. They were the reforms of an administrator, and administrators rarely become heroes. But they were the foundation upon which everything that came after was built, because they turned the Navy from a personal instrument of the Crown into something more like a modern institution, governed by rules and procedures that outlasted any individual. Pepys understood something that few of his contemporaries grasped, that in the long run a Navy's effectiveness depends less on the quality of its admirals than on the quality of its institutions, and that building those institutions requires exactly the kind of patient, unglamorous, detail-oriented work that he excelled at. His library of 3,000 carefully arranged books survives at Magdalen College, Cambridge, and it is one of the most extraordinary personal collections in the English-speaking world, a monument to the mind of the man who made the Royal Navy professional. Pepys's diary, which he stopped keeping in 1669 when his eyesight began to fail him, remained unknown to the public for over 150 years. It was written in a modified form of shorthand that had to be decoded by a Cambridge undergraduate named John Smith, who spent 3 years transcribing it in the early 19th century. Ironically, the key to the shorthand was sitting in a nearby shelf of Pepys's library the entire time, though Smith didn't know it. When it was finally published, it caused an immediate sensation, not because of its historical content, but because of its personal frankness. Here was a man of the 17th century writing about himself with a candour and self-awareness that seemed startlingly modern. The diary made Pepys famous in a way that his administrative achievements never quite had, and it has kept him famous ever since, which is not entirely fair to the administrator, but is entirely characteristic of how history works. The Navy that Pepys helped to create was not merely more efficient than what had preceded it. It was different in kind, governed by principles that would have seemed radical to a naval administrator of the Tudor period. The idea that an officer's commission should depend on demonstrated competence rather than social connection alone, the idea that contracts should be awarded through competitive bidding rather than personal favour, the idea that the Navy's accounts should be auditable and its stores inventoried and its expenditure tracked through time. These were not merely administrative reforms. They were statements about what kind of institution the Navy was and what kind of people it should contain. The culture they created was not perfect. The Navy of the 18th century was still full of patronage and influence, and the casual cruelty of a hierarchical institution operating in brutal conditions. But it had a foundation of professional competence that the armies of most European states lacked, and that foundation proved, again and again, to be the difference between victory and defeat. The relationship between the Pepys-era Navy and the culture of the Restoration period more broadly is one of the more fascinating aspects of his career. The court of Charles II was simultaneously one of the most sophisticated and one of the most dissolute in European history, a place of genuine wit and intellectual energy and aesthetic ambition that was also a place of spectacular corruption and sexual license that the Puritan Commonwealth had suppressed and the Restoration had released with the enthusiasm of a dam breaking. Pepys was entirely at home in this environment, a man who combined genuine intellectual curiosity and administrative talent with an appetite for pleasure and social advancement that he himself recognized as potentially dangerous to his integrity. His diary is, among other things, a sustained record of his efforts to be both a good public servant and a human being with ordinary human weaknesses, and the tension between those two things gives it much of its moral interest. He was not always successful, but he was always honest about his failures, at least in private, and that honesty is itself a form of integrity. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 transformed English foreign policy in ways that would profoundly affect the Navy. William III brought to England not only his formidable military and diplomatic abilities, but also the Dutch financial revolution. The Bank of England, founded in 1694 primarily to finance naval and military expenditure, gave the English state access to credit on a scale and at a rate of interest that was simply unavailable to France. This financial advantage would prove, in the long run, to be as important as any military victory. A state that can borrow cheaply and reliably can maintain a navy through years of expensive warfare. A state that cannot is always one bad harvest, or one lost battle away from having to choose between its sailors and its soldiers. The wars against Louis XIV, the 9 Years' War of 1689 to 1697, and the War of the Spanish Succession from 1702 to 1713, were geopolitical struggles over the balance of power in Europe, and the Navy's role in them was to prevent France from establishing naval dominance over the Channel and the Atlantic. The early years produced a serious crisis at Beachy Head in June 1690, when the Earl of Torrington's combined Anglo-Dutch fleet was defeated by a larger, French force under Tourville. It was a genuine scare, and it drove a major investment in naval rebuilding that would produce the fleet that fought at Barfleur 2 years later. The Battle of Barfleur and the subsequent action at La Hogue in May 1692 were the Navy's answer to the humiliation of Beachy Head. Tourville, operating under direct orders from Louis XIV that gave him no discretion whatsoever, attacked a superior Anglo-Dutch fleet with 44 ships against 99. The result was inevitable. 12 French ships of the line were ultimately destroyed, and the army Louis had assembled to restore James II to the English throne watched from the Norman beaches as the fleet meant to protect their crossing burned in the shallows. The scale of the pyrotechnics was extraordinary. Contemporary accounts describe fires visible for miles, black smoke towering over the Norman coast, English sailors rowing into the flames to complete the destruction of French ships that had beached, themselves in the panic, and James himself stood among the watchers, seeing his last real military hope consumed by fire he could do nothing to extinguish. The capture of Gibraltar in 1704 was an action of considerable boldness that produced one of Britain's most enduring strategic possessions. The massive limestone rock, jutting from the southern tip of Spain into the narrow entrance of the Mediterranean, had been regarded as impregnable for centuries. Admiral Rooke's assault was improvised from a campaign that had otherwise produced little, undertaken in a spirit of frustrated opportunism rather than careful planning. The garrison, a small Spanish force, was surprised and overwhelmed within a few hours. Britain has held the rock ever since, despite multiple sieges and persistent diplomatic pressure, and the reason is simple. The man who holds Gibraltar controls the entrance to the Mediterranean, and no serious naval power has ever been willing to give that up voluntarily. The Peace of Utrecht in 1713, which ended the War of Spanish Succession, confirmed Britain's new status as a major European power in a way that no previous treaty had done. Alongside Gibraltar, the treaty gave Britain Minorca, another Mediterranean base, as well as trading privileges in the Spanish-American colonies that opened the door to the enormous commercial expansion of the 18th century. The Navy had made all of this possible, not through any single dramatic victory, but through a decade of sustained presence and operational effectiveness that had gradually tilted the balance of Atlantic power in Britain's favour. The War of the Spanish Succession is often overshadowed in British historical memory by the more famous campaigns of Wellington in the Napoleonic Wars, but it was in many ways the more consequential conflict for the development of British power. The alliances it created, the commercial privileges it secured, and the bases it established gave Britain a strategic position in Europe and in the wider world that it had never previously enjoyed and would never subsequently relinquish. The partnership between English and Dutch financial power that funded the war, the Bank of England's ability to borrow at low interest rates underwritten by Dutch investment, was as important as any military victory, and its consequences outlasted the battles. Britain emerged from Utrecht in 1713 as a power of the first rank, capable of contending with France on equal terms, and it did so because its navy had been the indispensable instrument of a strategy that combined military pressure with commercial ambition in ways that no previous English government had quite managed. The fighting instructions and tactical doctrine that emerged from the wars against Louis XIV were codified and refined during the long peace that followed Utrecht, and they formed the basis of British naval tactics for most of the 18th century. The line of battle, the arrangement of warships in a single file so that their broadsides could be brought to bear simultaneously, was the foundation of everything, and the instructions that governed when captains could deviate from it were detailed and prescriptive to a degree that sometimes verged on absurdity. The court-martial of Admiral Byng was the extreme expression of a culture that had become so focused on the formal rules of engagement that it had partially lost sight of the underlying purpose those rules were meant to serve. It took men of Nelson's temperament and vision, and the institutional shock of repeated disappointments in battle, to break free of this rigidity and rediscover the aggressive initiative that had made the Elizabethan and Commonwealth navies so effective. To understand the Georgian navy at its height, you need to understand what it actually meant to be a sailor in the 18th century, because the wooden walls of England were crewed by men whose daily lives were a mixture of the tedious and the terrifying, shaped by a rigid hierarchy that could be brutal in its punishments and surprisingly humane in some of its customs. The gap between the myth of the Jolly Jack Tar, cheerful and patriotic and singing his way through storms, and the reality of life below decks in a ship of the line is considerable. And yet the myth was not entirely invented. There was a genuine culture of pride and solidarity among naval crews that coexisted with the harshness of naval discipline, and understanding both is essential to understanding how the Georgian Navy worked. The vast majority of sailors in the Royal Navy during this period did not volunteer. They were pressed. The press gang, officially the impress service, was a legally sanctioned form of kidnapping by which able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 55, who could be shown to follow the sea by trade, were liable to be seized by naval press gangs and compelled to serve. In practice, this extended to anyone who looked vaguely nautical and was unfortunate enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. A man might leave home one morning to walk to the market town and find himself by nightfall locked in a naval tender in the Thames estuary, with no means of communication and no prospect of release until the war ended. His family might not know what had happened to him for months. The conditions below decks on an 18th century warship were extraordinary by modern standards. A ship of the line might carry 700 men in a hull perhaps 200 feet long. The sailors lived and slept in hammocks slung between the guns on the gun decks, 14 inches of space allowed per man. They ate salt beef and salt pork that had sometimes been in barrels for years before it reached their plates, ship's biscuits so thoroughly colonised by weevils that veterans learned to eat it in the dark so as not to see what they were consuming, and a daily ration of rum diluted with water and citrus juice. The grog that was both a morale measure and a protection against the scurvy that had historically killed more sailors than any enemy action. The lime or lemon juice was the crucial ingredient, its vitamin C preventing the devastating deficiency disease that had ended so many long voyages prematurely. James Lind, a naval surgeon, conducted what is often called the first controlled clinical trial in history in 1747, testing 6 different proposed remedies for scurvy on 12 sailors with the disease, and finding that only those given oranges and lemons recovered. His finding took years to be adopted by the Admiralty. The bureaucratic inertia of a large institution is not a modern invention, but when it was, it transformed the Navy's operational reach. A fleet that could stay at sea for months without its crew dying of vitamin deficiency could project power at distances and for durations that were simply not possible before. The humble lime, issued as part of a sailor's daily ration, was in its quiet way as important a piece of naval technology as the cannon or the compass. The Georgian Navy was also the navy of exploration in the most expansive sense. James Cook's 3 voyages in the 1760s and 1770s were naval operations as much as they were scientific expeditions. Cook held a naval commission, His ships were Royal Navy vessels, and they transformed the European understanding of the Pacific Ocean from a vast and mysterious expanse into a relatively well-mapped ocean with documented coastlines, measured currents, and charted hazards. Cook's first voyage, from 1768 to 1771, in the converted Whitby collier Endeavour, charted the entire coastline of New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia. His second voyage took him further south than anyone had previously sailed, twice crossing the Antarctic Circle and reaching within sight of the Antarctic ice shelf. His third voyage, from 1776 to 1779, brought him to the northwestern coast of North America and to Hawaii, where he was killed in a dispute with the local inhabitants in February 1779. He was 50 years old. The charts he'd made during his 3 voyages were used by navigators for the next century and remain impressive monuments to the skill and thoroughness of 18th century naval surveying. Discipline was enforced by the cat-o'-nine tails, a whip of 9 knotted cords that could tear a man's back to ribbons in a dozen strokes. Flogging was the standard punishment for a wide range of offences, from drunkenness to sleeping on watch, carried out at the gangway in front of the assembled ship's company, with a ritual that underlined its public and exemplary purpose. The Articles of War, read aloud to the crew at regular intervals, made clear in language of considerable grimness what fate awaited those who transgressed. And yet the Navy also had a culture of fierce corporate pride and genuine camaraderie that existed alongside the brutality. Men who had served together through storms and battles and the grinding tedium of long blockades, developed bonds of loyalty that were as real and as deep as any formed on land. The 7 Years' War, which Britain fought from 1756 to 1763 against France and its allies, was the first genuinely global war in history, fought simultaneously in North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the European continent, and the Royal Navy was the thread that connected all its disparate theatres. William Pitt the Elder directed British strategy with a clarity of vision that made the Navy the pivot of everything. He blockaded the French coast so effectively that France could neither reinforce its overseas garrisons nor bring home the revenues of its colonies. He used naval power to enable amphibious operations that fell upon French possessions around the world, like a series of hammer blows: Quebec, Bengal, Senegal, Guadeloupe. All fell in the space of a few years to British forces carried and supported by the Royal Navy. The Peace of Paris in 1763 gave Britain the most favourable peace terms any European power had received in generations. The Navy had won an empire. This period also produced the most notorious episode in the Navy's 18th century history. Admiral John Byng was sent to relieve the British garrison on the Mediterranean island of Minorca in 1756, fought an indecisive action against the French fleet, and then withdrew to Gibraltar without making further attempts to relieve the garrison, which subsequently surrendered. He was court-martialed, found guilty, and shot by firing squad on the quarter-deck of HMS Monarch in Portsmouth Harbour in March 1757. Voltaire famously satirised the execution in Candide, having his character Candide witness the shooting, and being told that in England it is thought wise to kill an admiral from time to time, to encourage the others. The execution of Byng was, by any careful reading of the evidence, a judicial murder. His punishment was disproportionate, the charges at least partly politically motivated, and he had fought his action with reasonable skill. But it did have the intended effect of concentrating subsequent admirals' minds wonderfully on the importance of aggressive action. The rating system that classified warships was an elegant piece of naval bureaucracy that made the enormous complexity of managing a large fleet somewhat more tractable. Ships were divided into 6 rates based on the number of guns they carried and the size of their crew. First rates, carrying 100 guns or more on 3 decks, were the battleships of their day, slow and magnificent and terrifying, their broadsides capable of firing over a ton of iron. Second and third rates carried between 60 and 100 guns and formed the backbone of any battle fleet. Fourth, fifth, and sixth rates were the lighter vessels, frigates and sloops and brigs, that performed the 1,000 tasks of scouting and convoy escort, and message carrying and general harassment of the enemy, that kept a navy functioning between its great fleet engagements. A frigate captain in the Georgian Navy had a freedom of independent action that a ship-of-the-line captain rarely enjoyed, and the best frigate captains, men like Pellew, Cochrane, and the fictional Hornblower who was partly inspired by them, became almost legendary figures for their combination of seamanship, aggression, and resource. The mutinies at Spithead and the Nore in 1797 were among the most serious internal crises the Navy faced in the entire 18th century, and they are worth dwelling on because of what they reveal about the tensions within an institution that combined genuine esprit de corps with systematic injustice. The Spithead Mutiny in April 1797 was essentially a strike by the Channel Fleet over pay and conditions. The men demanded increases in wages that had not changed since the reign of Charles II, improvements in the quality of food, better treatment for the sick and wounded, and the removal of certain hated officers. Their demands were remarkably moderate and their discipline remarkably good. They continued to drill and to man their ships, merely refusing to put to sea until their grievances were addressed. The government, initially alarmed, eventually agreed to most of their demands, and the fleet went back to work. The Nore mutiny that followed was more radical and less disciplined, and it was suppressed with considerable severity, its leaders hanged. But together, the two mutinies had demonstrated something important, that the men who actually sailed and fought the Navy's ships were not simply passive instruments of their officers' will, that they had expectations and limits, and a collective voice that could not be permanently ignored. The prize money system that enriched successful naval officers, and occasionally even their crews, was one of the Navy's most effective recruiting tools and one of its most powerful motivators in battle. When a ship captured an enemy vessel, the prize was taken before the Admiralty Court, assessed for its value, and a proportion distributed among the officers and crew, according to a formula that heavily favoured the captain and the other commissioned officers, but still left something for the ordinary sailors. A successful frigate captain could become wealthy in a single commission, and some of the most famous fortunes in Georgian England were made on the sea. Cuthbert Collingwood, who was Nelson's closest friend and who led the lee column at Trafalgar, was known for his frugality and his discomfort with the prize money system, even as he benefited from it. He reportedly spent his shore leaves planting acorns in the hedgerows of Northumberland, so that England would have enough oak for future warships. Whether or not the story is strictly accurate, it captures something true about a man who saw the Navy not as a means to personal enrichment, but as a permanent institution whose needs extended into a future beyond his own lifetime. The relationship between the Navy and the civilian world it protected was more complex than simple patriotism and gratitude might suggest. Press gangs were feared and resented in coastal communities, and the Navy's reputation in port towns was not universally heroic. Sailors on shore leave were often drunk, frequently violent, and reliably prone to the various forms of misbehaviour that result when young men who have been confined in close quarters for months suddenly find themselves with money in their pockets and nobody to give them orders. The annual riot or two in Plymouth or Portsmouth was accepted as a kind of tax on the Navy's presence, managed by the civil authorities with a combination of tolerance and firm action that had been refined over generations. And yet the same communities that dreaded the press gang also took a fierce pride in their naval sons and brothers, celebrated their victories with genuine enthusiasm, and wept genuinely when ships were lost. The Navy was, in the end, inseparable from the communities that surrounded it, and those communities were inseparable from the Navy. There is a particular quality to the story of Horatio Nelson that resists the normal rules of biography, because the events of his life are so extreme, the losses so disproportionate, the victories so absolute, and the death so perfectly staged, that the whole thing reads more like mythology than history. And yet every detail is documented, recorded in letters and dispatches and eyewitness accounts, verifiable in ways that mythology never is. Nelson was real, the wounds were real, the victories were real, and the curious thing about him is that the more carefully you look at the evidence, the more extraordinary the story becomes rather than less. He was born in 1758 in the Norfolk village of Burnham Thorpe, the sixth child of a country parson, a small and sickly child who joined the Navy at 12 years old as a midshipman. He suffered terribly from seasickness, a fact he never entirely overcame. He sailed to the Arctic on an expedition that attempted to find a northern passage to the Pacific and found instead nothing but ice. He served on the East Indies Station, where he contracted a fever so severe that he was invalided home and spent months in recovery, during which he later claimed to have experienced something like a spiritual crisis and a renewed sense of purpose. He received his first command at 20, and he settled into the pattern of his early career: competent, ambitious, occasionally reckless, and not yet famous. He lost the sight of his right eye during an expedition against Corsica in 1794, when a French artillery shot near him threw up a spray of gravel and sand that abraded the cornea. He lost his right arm in 1797 during a disastrous boat attack on the town of Santa Cruz de Tenerife, when a musket ball shattered his arm above the elbow, and it was amputated on the deck of his flagship within 30 minutes. He was 47 years old when he died, and already blind in one eye and one-armed, and it is worth pausing on this, that the man who became the greatest naval hero in British history fought his defining battles in a state of significant physical disability, that the wounds which would have ended most men's careers seemed, if anything, to intensify his energy and sharpen his already acute sense of his own mortality. The personal dimension of Nelson's story is inseparable from his public one, and the most important personal relationship of his life was with Emma Hamilton, the wife of the British ambassador to Naples, whom he met in 1793, and with whom he fell genuinely and quite scandalously in love on their second meeting in 1798. Emma Hamilton was a remarkable woman in her own right. Born Amy Lyon in Cheshire in 1765, the daughter of a blacksmith, she had made her way through a series of difficult circumstances to become the hostess of one of the most celebrated salons in Europe, a woman of intelligence and charm whose beauty had been famously captured in dozens of portraits by George Romney. Nelson's love letters to Emma are among the most extraordinary documents in naval history, not because they are beautifully written, which they sometimes are, but because they reveal with such unguarded intensity the interior life of a man who was habitually described in official accounts as cool and controlled. He was, in private, nothing of the kind. His great victories came in quick succession in the last decade of the 18th century and the first decade of the 19th. The Battle of the Nile in August 1798 was fought in the dark in the shallow waters of Aboukir Bay on the Egyptian coast, where the French fleet under Vice Admiral Brueys had anchored in what he believed was a position of safety. Nelson attacked immediately, sending half his fleet to attack from the landward side while the other half attacked from seaward. The French flagship Orient, one of the largest warships in the world, caught fire and exploded at around 10 o'clock in the evening, an explosion so loud that both fleets temporarily stopped firing, stunned by the violence of it. The fireball could be seen from Cairo. By morning, 13 of the 17 French ships of the line had been taken or destroyed, and Napoleon's army in Egypt was stranded without hope of rescue. It was one of the most decisive naval victories ever won. Copenhagen in April 1801 showed a different side of Nelson, his willingness to take calculated political risks as well as military ones. The battle was fought against the Danish fleet, which threatened to close the Baltic to British shipping. When his commanding officer hoisted the signal to discontinue the action, Nelson is reported to have put his telescope to his blind eye and declared that he could see no such signal. Whether or not the exact words are accurate, the action was real. Nelson continued the battle, won it, and then achieved by diplomatic means the political settlement that had been the whole point of the exercise. It was characteristic of a man whose genius lay not only in tactical innovation, but in the understanding that naval battles exist to serve political ends. Trafalgar came on October 21, 1805, off the southwestern Cape of Spain. Nelson's plan was radical. Instead of forming his fleet into the traditional line of battle, he would attack in two divisions, sailing perpendicular to the enemy line and cutting through it at 2 points. The leading ships would be exposed to terrible raking fire as they approached, but the resulting confusion would create the close-quarters melee that his better-trained crews would win. He knew he was likely to die. He had told his captains so at the dinner aboard Victory the night before the battle, speaking with the matter-of-fact calmness of a man who has made his peace with a particular outcome. He had written his prayer and his will and his letter to Emma Hamilton, and he had composed the signal that would be hoisted as the fleets converged. England expects that every man will do his duty. The battle that followed lasted about 4 hours. 18 French and Spanish ships were taken or destroyed. No British ships were lost. The combined fleet ceased to exist as a fighting force, and Nelson was dead, shot by a French marksman at approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, carried below decks to die in the cockpit as his fleet won the battle around him. His last reported words were, "Thank God I have done my duty." The ship that brought his body home, HMS Victory, still floats in Portsmouth Harbour today, the oldest commissioned warship in the world, her decks worn smooth by the feet of millions of visitors who walk over the spot where Nelson fell and stand in the low-ceilinged cockpit where he died, trying to imagine what it sounded and smelled and felt like on that autumn afternoon in 1805 when the world changed. The strategic context of the Napoleonic Wars at sea is sometimes lost in the drama of individual battles, but it is essential to understanding why those battles mattered. Napoleon's continental system, his attempt to blockade Britain economically by closing all European ports to British trade, was his response to the fact that after Trafalgar he could not attack Britain militarily. The British counter-blockade of French and French-controlled ports was the Navy's main strategic mission for most of the period between 1805 and 1815, and it was carried out by an extraordinary sustained effort that kept British squadrons at sea in all weathers for months and years at a time. The men who maintained the blockade of Brest, the most important of all the French naval bases, spent years within sight of the French coast, in weather that ranged from the monotonous to the murderous, in conditions of cramped and smelly discomfort, broken only by the occasional violent storm or the rare and terrifying excitement of a French sortie. They were not glamorous, they were not famous, but they were the reason Napoleon never got his fleet to sea again after Trafalgar. The frigate war that ran alongside the great fleet battles was in many ways the more continuous and operationally significant dimension of the naval conflict. Frigates, fast, lightly armoured, single-deck warships typically carrying 30 to 40 guns, were the workhorses of naval warfare, performing the tasks that the great ships of the line were too slow and too valuable to be risked on. Commerce raiding, convoy escort, diplomatic courier duty, the harassment of enemy coasting trade, amphibious operations in support of land forces. The frigate captains of the Napoleonic era were among the most celebrated naval officers of their generation, precisely because their work was more visible and more varied than that of the fleet commanders. They won individual battles that were reported in the newspapers, captured rich prizes whose value could be calculated and distributed as prize money, and performed feats of seamanship that became the stuff of popular legend. Thomas Cochrane, the inspiration for several fictional heroes, commanded a 20-gun brig against a 32-gun Spanish frigate in 1801, and compelled her surrender through a combination of bluff and brilliance that became one of the most celebrated actions of the age. The logistical achievement of maintaining Nelson's fleet during the years of Trafalgar is itself a story that deserves telling, because battles do not win themselves, and fleets do not appear from nowhere. The fleet that fought at Trafalgar had been at sea, in various configurations, for most of the 2 years preceding the battle, sustained by a supply chain of extraordinary complexity that stretched from the English dockyards to the victualling yards at Gibraltar, and the watering places at Sardinia and the Moroccan coast. The ships needed constant repair. Standing rigging chafed and parted, sails wore out, hull planking needed recalking, guns needed replacing when they split or burst, men needed replacing when they died of disease or accident or the occasional encounter with the enemy. All of this was managed by a system of naval administration that Pepys had begun to build a century and a half earlier, and that had been refined and improved by decades of practical experience. The Trafalgar campaign was not simply a triumph of courage and tactics, it was a triumph of institutional competence. The victory at Trafalgar solved one problem and created another. It solved the problem of French naval power. Napoleon never again had the naval resources to threaten Britain directly at sea, but it created the subtler challenge of success. An institution that wins its defining battle and then faces no comparable threat for 50 years, risks becoming a monument rather than a force. The Royal Navy in the decades after Trafalgar was celebrated, funded, admired, and largely untested in any contest approaching the scale of the recent wars. It accumulated traditions and rituals with the enthusiasm of an institution that has confused ritual with readiness, promoted officers on the basis of seniority in a system of glacial rigidity, and governed itself with a conservatism that was partly admirable caution and partly simple institutional inertia. And then the world changed. The steam engine arrived at sea, and the Royal Navy's response was characteristically cautious. Steam machinery was dirty, used enormous quantities of coal, required engineers who were regarded by traditional officers with condescension, and seemed to create a dependency on coaling stations that was incompatible with the global strategic freedom that sail had provided. These objections were not entirely unreasonable. Early marine steam engines were enormously unreliable, fuel consumption was prodigious, and the paddle wheels of the first generation of steamships were vulnerable to gunfire in ways that a sailing ship's rigging was not. The solution was the screw propeller, which could be retracted when not in use and was less vulnerable than paddle wheels. HMS Rattler, launched in 1843, demonstrated her superiority over paddle propulsion in a famous trial in which she towed the paddle steamer Alecto backward at over 2 knots, while the Alecto's engines ran at full power. Even this was merely an adaptation, a sailing warship with an auxiliary engine, rather than a genuine rethinking of what a warship should be. The Victorian Navy did more than simply police an empire. It actively shaped the world in which the empire operated, through a continuous program of surveying, chart-making and hydrographic work that made the world's oceans navigable in a way they had never previously been. The Hydrographic Office of the Admiralty, established in 1795, grew throughout the 19th century into one of the most productive scientific institutions in the world, producing detailed charts of coastlines, harbours, river mouths, and ocean currents that commercial shipping depended on for its safety. British charts were sold to merchant navies around the world and used by navigators of all nations, because the Royal Navy's surveying operations were simply the most thorough and the most reliably accurate available. Charles Darwin's voyage on HMS Beagle, which lasted from 1831 to 1836, was an Admiralty hydrographic survey that carried as passenger a young Cambridge naturalist, whose observations during the voyage led directly to the theory of evolution by natural selection. The Navy, in other words, was not merely a military institution. It was a vehicle for the expansion of human knowledge on a global scale. The suppression of the slave trade was another dimension of the Victorian Navy's work that deserves more recognition than it typically receives. The West Africa Squadron, maintained on the Guinea coast from 1808 onward, was charged with intercepting slave ships and freeing the enslaved people aboard them. Between 1808 and 1867, the squadron captured or destroyed around 1,600 slave ships and freed approximately 150,000 enslaved people. The cost in British lives was significant. The West African coast was one of the most disease-ridden places on Earth, and mortality from yellow fever and malaria among the sailors and officers of the squadron was appalling. But the mission continued year after year, carried out by men who understood that they were doing something genuinely important, however far from home, and however forgotten they might feel in the fever-ridden months between one action and the next. That rethinking of what a warship should be came fully with HMS Warrior, launched in 1860. She was 320 feet long, iron-hulled, armoured with wrought-iron plates 4.5 inches thick, powered by an enormous steam engine that could drive her at 14 knots, and armed with 40 guns, including some of the most powerful breech-loading weapons then in existence. She was faster than any contemporary warship, afloat and armoured against the heaviest guns then in service. When she was commissioned, she rendered every other warship in the world obsolete at a stroke. The Warrior lies today in Portsmouth Harbour, restored to her original appearance by a dedicated team of volunteers, and she is perhaps the most poignant object in the whole of British naval history. A ship that was revolutionary in its time, that was never actually used in anger, that spent most of its working life as a floating jetty, and that now stands as a bridge between the wooden world of Nelson and the steel world of the 20th century. The Crimean War of 1854 to 1856, fought in alliance with France against Russia, was the Victorian Navy's most significant operational test before the opening of the 20th century, and it produced a mixture of useful lessons and uncomfortable revelations. The Black Sea Squadron that bombarded Sebastopol and the Baltic Squadron that operated against Russian coastal fortifications both demonstrated the effectiveness of steam-powered warships in shallow inshore waters, where sailing vessels would have been dangerously dependent on favourable winds. But they also demonstrated the limitations of the Navy's bombardment capabilities against modern fortifications, and they raised questions about the adequacy of the Navy's supply and maintenance systems that would take decades to fully address. Florence Nightingale's work at Scutari during the Crimean War is the best-known consequence of the conflict's medical disasters, but similar disasters afflicted the naval forces, and their eventual resolution owed as much to naval surgeons working in difficult conditions aboard cramped warships as it did to the more celebrated work on shore. The ironclad revolution of the 1860s unfolded with a speed that left even the most technically sophisticated naval officers struggling to keep up. In the space of less than a decade, the wooden sailing warship that had been the dominant instrument of naval power for 3 centuries became completely obsolete, and the Navy found itself having to rethink not merely its technology, but its tactics, its training, its officer education, and its entire approach to naval warfare. The Battle of Hampton Roads in 1862 during the American Civil War, in which the ironclad CSS Virginia fought the USS Monitor to a stalemate that destroyed 3 wooden warships in the process, was watched by every naval attaché in America with an intensity that bordered on panic. The Admiralty was no exception. The implications were clear. Any wooden warship that encountered an ironclad in action would be destroyed. The transition to iron could not be delayed. The transition from sail to steam in the Navy was not merely a technical change, but a social and cultural one, and its effects on the officer corps were particularly significant. The sailing Navy had been an institution in which seamanship, the ability to handle a ship under canvas, to read wind and weather, to navigate by dead reckoning and celestial observation, to manage a crew in the sustained physical demands of sail, was the fundamental professional skill, the thing that every officer had to master before anything else could be learned. The steam navy required different skills, a knowledge of machinery, of engineering principles, of the management of coal supplies and boiler maintenance that the older generation of officers found alien and unwelcome. The engineers who kept the steam engines running were not initially commissioned officers at all. They were warrant officers or civilian employees, men without social standing in the naval hierarchy, whose expertise the Navy needed, and whose status it was reluctant to acknowledge. The gradual integration of engineering expertise into the Naval Officer Corps was one of the significant social dramas of the Victorian Navy, and it was not resolved without considerable friction and prejudice. In 1906, HMS Dreadnought slid down the slipway at Portsmouth and changed the world. She carried 10 12-inch guns arranged so that an unprecedented 8 of them could fire directly ahead or astern. She was driven by new turbine engines that gave her a speed of 21 knots, faster than most cruisers. She made every battleship then afloat, including every British battleship, obsolete at a stroke. The man responsible for her was Admiral Sir John Fisher, the first Sea Lord, a compact and ferociously energetic officer who had come to the conclusion that half of the Navy should be scrapped and rebuilt on entirely new principles. His vision for the dreadnought was vindicated so completely that her name became a common noun, and for the following decade the great powers of Europe engaged in a building race to accumulate as many of them as possible. The naval race between Britain and Germany that dominated the decade before the First World War had a quality of mutual anxiety that seems, in retrospect, almost tragic. Germany was building a fleet not large enough to defeat the Royal Navy in open battle, but large enough to threaten British supremacy and therefore be useful as a diplomatic bargaining chip. Britain was building fast enough to maintain the two-power standard and therefore make the German chip worthless. Both sides spent enormous sums on ships that neither particularly wanted to use, in a relationship of competitive paranoia that contributed materially to the conditions that produced the War of 1914. The submarine question that came to dominate the First World War at sea had been visible to thoughtful naval officers for decades before the war began. The Royal Navy purchased its first submarines in 1901, and while the early boats were small, slow, and extremely dangerous to their crews, they demonstrated clearly enough that the technology worked in principle, and would work much better once the engineering problems were resolved. Admiral Fisher was a strong advocate of submarines as instruments of asymmetric warfare that could threaten even the most powerful battle fleet. His opponents argued that submarine warfare against merchant shipping was un-English and would never be adopted by a civilized nation. They were wrong on the last point, and their wrongness contributed materially to Britain's unpreparedness for the U-boat campaign of 1917. When the war came, the expected great battle of dreadnoughts was strangely slow to materialize. The German high seas fleet was powerful but outnumbered, and its commanders were not willing to risk it in a straight fight against the British Grand Fleet under Admiral Sir John Jellicoe. The British maintained a distant blockade that slowly strangled the German economy. Jellicoe was described by Churchill as the only man on either side who could lose the war in an afternoon, a comment that acknowledged his caution as much as his importance. And his caution was, in the circumstances, not unreasonable. Britain's naval supremacy was the single most important strategic asset it possessed, and risking the Grand Fleet in a battle that might end in defeat was gambling everything on a single throw. The one great clash came in May 1916, off the coast of Danish Jutland. It was the largest naval battle in history at that point, involving around 250 ships and 100,000 men. The opening phase saw the British battlecruisers catch the worst of it. HMS Indefatigable, HMS Queen Mary, and HMS Invincible all blew up within a few hours, their magazines igniting when armour-piercing shells penetrated their turrets. Beatty, watching his ships explode around him, made his famous remark, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." He was right, and what was wrong was partly a design flaw. The battlecruisers had been built for speed at the expense of armour, and partly the exceptional accuracy of German gunnery on that particular afternoon. As the afternoon wore on, Jellicoe brought up the main body of the Grand Fleet and deployed it with remarkable skill, crossing the T of the German line. Scheer executed a series of emergency turns to disengage, fighting his way free with great skill, but finding himself blocked by the Grand Fleet each time he tried to break for home. Night fell with the German fleet still at large, and in the darkness it slipped through the tail of the British fleet and escaped. The Germans declared Jutland a victory, and by the narrow measure of casualties they were right. But the high seas fleet never came out to fight again. The real naval threat of the First World War came not from the surface battle fleet, but from below the water. Germany's U-boats were sinking approximately 1 in 4 of all ships sailing to Britain by the spring of 1917, at a rate that threatened to cut off the island's food supply within months. The solution was the convoy system, grouping merchant ships into large, escorted formations rather than allowing them to sail independently. The Admiralty had resisted this for years on the grounds that convoys were too difficult to manage, and that large groups of ships were easier targets. Both arguments were wrong. When convoys were finally introduced in April and May of 1917, under enormous political pressure from the War Cabinet, the rate of sinkings dropped immediately and dramatically. The convoy debate is a case study in institutional resistance to uncomfortable evidence, a reminder that the most important battles are sometimes fought in committee rooms rather than at sea. The social history of the Navy in the First World War is as remarkable as its operational history, and it has received far less attention. The Navy that went to war in 1914 was in many respects a Victorian institution that had not yet come to terms with the technical and social changes of the Edwardian decade. Its officer corps was still drawn predominantly from the same narrow social base it had always recruited from, the sons of naval and military families, of the gentry, of the professional class. The Second World War began for the Royal Navy before it began for everyone else. On the night of September 3rd, 1939, the very day that Britain declared war on Germany, the passenger liner Athenia was torpedoed by a German submarine 300 miles northwest of Ireland, with the loss of 117 lives. The U-boat war had started immediately, without warning, and the Admiralty found itself confronting exactly the same strategic problem that had nearly defeated it in 1917, but now with a smaller merchant fleet, a larger submarine threat, and the burden of learning again from scratch. The lessons that had been painfully acquired last time, and then allowed to fade in the years of peace. The fall of France in the summer of 1940 transformed the naval situation catastrophically. Germany occupied the Atlantic coast of France, and established U-boat bases at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire and Bordeaux, cutting weeks off the transit time to the Atlantic hunting grounds, and giving U-boat commanders access to areas far beyond the reach of British air cover. The first happy time, as German submariners grimly called it, ran from the summer of 1940 through the early months of 1941, and the sinkings were appalling. Britain was hemorrhaging ships and the trained merchant sailors who crewed them faster than they could be replaced, and the food and raw materials those ships were supposed to be carrying were sitting on the Atlantic seabed instead. Before the Battle of the Atlantic consumed the Navy's full attention, there was Dunkirk. The evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from the beaches of northern France in late May and early June of 1940 was one of the most extraordinary improvisations in military history. Over 9 days, in conditions of constant air attack, and with the German army closing from 3 sides, the Navy organised the evacuation of over 338,000 British and French soldiers. It used every vessel it could find. Destroyers, cross-channel ferries, hospital ships, minesweepers, and the famous fleet of little ships, pleasure cruisers, fishing boats, Thames barges, lifeboats, that crossed the channel crewed by a mixture of naval ratings and civilian volunteers. 6 destroyers were sunk and 19 more damaged, and dozens of smaller vessels were destroyed. But the soldiers got home. The Normandy landings were the culmination of 3 years of amphibious learning that had been paid for in blood at Dieppe in 1942, when a combined British and Canadian force was landed on the French coast in a raid that resulted in catastrophic losses and demonstrated with brutal clarity how much remained to be learned about the art of assault from the sea. The Dieppe disaster was not wasted. Every lesson it provided about the need for fire support, the vulnerability of landing craft on open beaches, the difficulty of coordinating air, sea and land forces in real time, was fed into the planning process for subsequent operations, first in North Africa, then in Sicily and Italy, and finally at Normandy. The destruction of HMS Hood on May 24, 1941, produced a shock that reverberated through the entire country. Hood was not merely a warship, she was an icon, the largest warship in the Royal Navy and one of the most beautiful ever built, a long, elegant hull that had been making goodwill visits around the world since her commissioning in 1920. She was sent to intercept the German battleship Bismarck in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. The engagement lasted approximately 8 minutes. A salvo from Bismarck struck Hood in a magazine, and she detonated catastrophically, breaking in 2 and sinking in 3 minutes. Of her crew of 1,418 men, 3 survived. The number has a particular quality of horror, not 300, not 30, but 3. The inadequacy of that number to represent 1,415 deaths is itself a kind of eloquence. The pursuit and sinking of the Bismarck that followed over the next 3 days had the quality of a naval thriller. British ships committed in enormous force, battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, all hunting across the North Atlantic with a ferocity born of grief and strategic necessity. The turning point came when a swordfish biplane from HMS Ark Royal, a fabric-covered open-cockpit aircraft that looked absurdly antiquated beside the steel battleship she was hunting, landed a torpedo hit on the Bismarck's rudder, jamming it and dooming her to sail in circles. The battleships closed in on the morning of May 27th, and the Bismarck went down fighting, her colours still flying as the shells tore her apart. The Battle of the Atlantic continued for 4 more years, reaching its crisis in early 1943 and then turning decisively in the Allies' favour. The victory owed everything to a combination of factors working together: very long-range aircraft that closed the mid-Atlantic air gap, the breaking of the German naval Enigma code at Bletchley Park, which allowed convoys to be routed away from U-boat patrol lines, improved radar and better depth charges and new anti-submarine weapons, and the accumulated experience of convoy escort that transformed ordinary destroyers and corvettes into genuine hunters. By May 1943, Dönitz had lost 41 U-boats in a single month, and reluctantly withdrew his fleet from the North Atlantic. The crisis was over, and with it the last serious threat to Britain's ability to sustain itself as a fighting nation. Operation Neptune, the naval component of the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, was the largest amphibious operation in history, nearly 7,000 ships of all types crossing the Channel or supporting the crossing, delivering over 150,000 soldiers to the French beaches in a single day. The planning had taken 2 years. The execution required coordination of staggering complexity, clearing the approaches of mines, suppressing coastal defences with naval gunfire, providing anti-submarine and anti-aircraft protection across the entire approach route, and landing tens of thousands of men and hundreds of vehicles on beaches with a tidal range of over 20 feet. That it succeeded was one of the greatest organisational achievements in the history of warfare, and the Navy was at the centre of it. In the Pacific, the British Pacific Fleet joined the Americans in the final campaign against Japan, contributing aircraft carriers and cruisers and destroyers to the enormous Allied Armada driving toward the Japanese home islands in 1944 and 1945. The armoured flight decks of the British carriers proved their worth when kamikaze aircraft struck them. Where unarmoured American carriers required days of repair, the British ships were often operational again within hours. When Japan surrendered in September 1945, British ships were among those, standing in Tokyo Bay, their presence a reminder that the Royal Navy had not only survived the most demanding test in its history, but had emerged from it still capable of operating at the furthest ends of the earth. The campaign in the Mediterranean during the Second World War is one of the least appreciated dimensions of British naval history, partly because it was overshadowed in public consciousness by the more dramatic events of the Atlantic and the Pacific, and partly because its outcomes were mixed in ways that made it less convenient for the kind of clear narrative that popular history prefers. The Navy fought in the Mediterranean from the very beginning of the war, initially in support of the North African campaign and the defence of Malta, later in support of the invasions of Sicily and Italy. It suffered severe losses. The aircraft carriers Ark Royal, Eagle and Hermes, the battleships Barham and Royal Oak, the cruisers and destroyers lost in the savage fighting around Crete. In 1941, the ships sunk by Italian frogmen in Alexandria harbour. The losses were continuous, and they were borne by men who were often operating at the extreme limit of what human endurance and naval technology could sustain. Malta deserves its own chapter in any history of the Navy, because the defence of that island, a small, virtually undefensible rock in the central Mediterranean, that happened to occupy the perfect strategic position for threatening the supply lines between Italy and North Africa, was one of the most significant naval campaigns of the entire war. The island was besieged from the air for 2.5 years, its population reduced to near starvation, its infrastructure repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt, and its continued resistance made possible only by the Navy's ability to push supply convoys through the gauntlet of Italian and German air and naval forces that surrounded it. Operation Pedestal in August 1942, the most costly of the Malta convoys, brought 14 merchant ships into the central Mediterranean under an escort of 2 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, 7 cruisers and 32 destroyers, and lost 9 of the 14 merchants along with 1 carrier, 2 cruisers and a destroyer. The tanker Ohio, so badly damaged that she had to be lashed between 2 destroyers and dragged into Grand Harbour by sheer determination, arrived with just enough fuel to keep Malta's aircraft flying for a few more weeks. The island held. The tide in North Africa turned shortly afterward. The human cost of the Second World War at sea is a dimension of the conflict that deserves more than the summary it usually receives. The merchant navy, the tens of thousands of civilian sailors who crewed the ships that brought food and oil and weapons to Britain throughout the war, suffered proportionally higher casualties than any of the armed services. They went to sea in ships that were frequently inadequately armed against the submarine threat, in convoys whose escort was often insufficient, in weather that added its own lethal dimension to the dangers of enemy action. They were not combatants in the formal sense, and they did not receive the pensions or the recognition that the armed services did. Many of them were very young, teenage boys who'd gone to sea in peacetime and found themselves in the middle of a naval war before they were old enough to have made any real choice about it. Their story is told, quietly and movingly, in the Battle of the Atlantic Museum in Liverpool, in a building that looks out over the Mersey toward the Atlantic, approaches where so many of them died. The decades after the Second World War brought a slow, painful, but ultimately necessary contraction of British naval power that mirrored the contraction of the empire it had been built to sustain. The great battleships were scrapped one by one through the late 1940s and 1950s. The aircraft carriers were decommissioned or sold, and the Navy shrank from the enormous force of wartime to something appropriate to a prosperous middle power in a changed world. The process was not without its agonies. The Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain and France attempted an old-fashioned gunboat intervention in Egypt without American support and were forced into humiliating retreat, was a moment of national reckoning that accelerated the recalibration of British strategic ambitions. The Falklands War of 1982 was a last unexpected demonstration of what remained. When Argentina invaded the British overseas territory of the Falkland Islands in April of that year, the British government dispatched a task force of astonishing improvisation. Aircraft carriers scheduled for decommissioning, merchant ships converted to military use with extraordinary speed, warships hastily loaded with supplies and ammunition, and sent south across 8,000 miles of open ocean to recapture islands most people in Britain could not locate on a map. The campaign that followed was won, narrowly, at the cost of 255 British lives and 3 ships sunk. It was fought with the kind of desperate professionalism that the Navy at its best had always managed to produce. Cold, difficult, far from home, against competent opposition, with inadequate resources and no margin for error. The men who fought it would have been recognised by Drake and by Blake and by Nelson. The Navy that exists today is a fraction of what it was at its height, but it is not a relic or a museum piece. 2 new aircraft carriers, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales, represent a return to genuine carrier strike capability. Nuclear-powered attack submarines patrol the deep oceans in permanent readiness. The 4 Vanguard-class submarines that carry the Trident nuclear missile system maintain, in continuous rotation at sea, a deterrent whose philosophical lineage runs back to the signal hoisted at Trafalgar, a statement to the world that Britain will respond, that the island is defended, that the sea remains its element and its frontier. The history of the British Navy is, in the end, the history of an idea, that an island can be a fortress, that the sea is not merely a boundary but a highway, and that the people who control the highway can, for a time, shape the world on its shores. The maps we use were made partly by Royal Navy surveying ships, men like James Cook who charted the Pacific from his small Whitby collier with a thoroughness and accuracy that saved thousands of lives over the following centuries. The legal frameworks that govern international trade at sea were shaped largely by British naval dominance and the treaties it produced. The languages spoken in dozens of countries around the world carry the traces of an empire whose outermost skeleton was the Royal Navy. And in the museums and dockyards of Britain, at Portsmouth, where the Victory and the Warrior and the Mary Rose await you, at Chatham, where the Victorian dockyard stands almost unchanged from the age it served, at Liverpool, where the Battle of the Atlantic is remembered with the quiet dignity it deserves, the ships themselves endure, or the bones of the ships endure, waiting for the next person to come and stand beside them and wonder about the men who sailed them and the world they made. They are patient, as old things are patient, and they will be there when you are ready to visit them. That is our story tonight. And what a story it has been. The full sweep of it, from Alfred's improvised fleet on the cold North Sea, to the nuclear submarines moving silently through the deep ocean trenches, from the clinker-built hulls of the Saxon shore to the steel supercarriers of the present day, from the first hesitant understanding that an island needs to control its surrounding waters, to the permanent global projection of a naval power that defined 5 centuries of British history. It is a long story and a rich one, and we have only touched its surface. Every chapter we have passed through tonight contains whole libraries of detail that we have not had time to explore, whole lives and whole battles and whole decades of patient institutional building that deserve their own tellings. Perhaps one night we will return and go deeper, and follow a single ship, or a single crew, or a single battle from sunrise to nightfall, and find within it all the richness of the larger story compressed into one human scale. For now, though, the tide is coming in, and the night is settling around us, and it is enough. Rest now, and let it drift with you into sleep. The sea is quiet, the ships are still, and history carries you gently forward on the tide. The watch is set, the lanterns are lit, and somewhere in the distance, barely audible now, there is the sound of the ocean, that ancient, patient, indifferent, magnificent ocean that shaped the nation and the story we have told tonight. Let it carry you the rest of the way. The story of the Royal Navy is ultimately inseparable from the story of British identity itself, and that connection runs deeper than patriotism or national pride, though it includes both. the sea has shaped the British imagination in ways that are still visible in the literature, the art, the music, and the daily idiom of the language. Phrases that were once specific to seafaring have become metaphors so embedded in ordinary speech that most people using them have no idea of their origins. To be taken aback, to be in the doldrums, to know the ropes, to sail close to the wind, to be on an even keel, to give someone a wide berth, to swing the lead, to cut and run. All of these come from the sailor's world, from the specific technical vocabulary of a working life at sea, and they have survived the disappearance of the world that produced them because they describe something true about human experience that does not belong only to sailors. The museums and memorial sites of the naval tradition are among the most visited places in Britain, which suggests that the appetite for this kind of history has not diminished with the passing of the age that produced it. HMS. Victory draws hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, including many who have no particular interest in naval history, but who are drawn by something they cannot quite name. The scale of the ship, perhaps, or the combination of beauty and violence that a warship embodies, or simply the sense of contact with the past that comes from standing in a space where real events of real consequence actually happened. The Mary Rose Museum, which opened in its final form in 2016, is one of the most affecting museums in the country, precisely because its subject is not strategy or technology, or naval power in the abstract, but the lives of ordinary men preserved by accident in the mud of the Solent and recovered by a project that required decades of patience and expertise. They were not admirals, they were not heroes in any recognisable sense. They were simply men who went to sea in the service of their king and did not come back, and the objects they left behind, the shoes, the combs, the dice, the rosary beads, the pewter plates, speak across 500 years with an intimacy that formal history rarely achieves. There is something else the British naval tradition gives to anyone who spends time with it, something that is harder to name than historical knowledge or cultural identity. It is a kind of perspective, a sense of scale. The sea is larger than any human institution and older than any nation, and the people who have sailed it have always known this, in their bones, if not always in their words. The Navy at its best was an institution that took ordinary people and placed them in extraordinary circumstances and asked them to maintain their discipline and their skill and their courage in conditions of genuine danger, far from home, with no certainty of return. Many of them failed this test, as ordinary people often do. Many more passed it, in ways they could not have predicted and would not have claimed credit for. The ships are gone, or mostly gone, and the empire they protected is gone, and the world they made is changed beyond recognition. But the sea remains, and the island remains, and the story of the people who stood between them is not finished yet.